But with this 19th century development, there were other things that were helpful in the rise of atheism, or at least a questioning of traditional religion. First was the development of Darwinism as a means to explain evolution. Specifically, Darwin's publication in 1859 of his book On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, which in some lists mark it as one of the most influential texts in the history of the Western world. While I wouldn't say it's the most important, it probably does warrant a place in the top of those lists because of how much it had an impact on especially the field of science. Now, Darwin isn't necessarily introducing something completely new in terms of evolution. There were people that had believed prior to Darwin that species had evolved over time, and that probably species had common ancestors. But it's Darwin's ability to explain the process by which that took place that makes the impact on the Western world. Essentially, Darwin's theory was that natural environmental conditions played a significant impact on how species developed. So species that were more fit for an environment tended to be the ones that survived. Right? Those that were able to, especially, have better access to food and better abilities to reproduce. And so, through that, nature, right, selected those aspects of species that would be the ones that would survive. Those would be the ones that would produce offspring. And often the idea was that certain genetic mutations made it easier or better or more profitable for certain species or certain elements within a species to survive. Obviously, it's a lot more complicated than that, but essentially that's the idea, right? That the environment and species adaptability would explain how this took place. But essentially, thinking about, all right, what's the religious the consequences of all this? Here was the opportunity to explain the diversity of life without the need for a creator being explicitly involved in it. And so the idea was that these were things that naturally took place through natural processes like finding food and reproducing. Darwin's training had been in theology, but even prior to his writing of On the Origin of Species, he moved away from the belief in a creator God. However, he doesn't make it that significant of a point, especially On the Origin of Species. Later in his life, he would claim that he's more agnostic about God. But what you have here is the opportunity for people to explain away the need for God. Now, there were some people in the 19th century who tried to hold on to Christianity, Judaism, other theistic ideas, and evolution. But essentially, we have here the development of a process by which you can say there's not a need to refer to God. Also important for this rise in modern atheism was the development of biblical criticism. In the middle of the 19th century in Germany, a school of thought developed that took the notions of evolution in the natural world and applied it to the biblical text. And so, in their attempt to try and explain how the Bible developed, evolutionary processes were applied to the Bible. And so instead of the belief that the Bible, the books of the Bible themselves were single products produced by one author at one time, people started to suggest, well, no, maybe it was the process of an evolution, right? That there was an original core text, and over time other layers were added to it. Pulling in ideas of comparison between texts or narratives within the Bible to texts found in other ancient Near East materials. Now again, there were some Christians who adopted this idea, thought that it was probable. But again, it opens up the opportunity for a lot of people to think about those texts as being a product of human forces alone, without the need to talk about God. A third development, again, around the same time, is the explanatory force of science. Previously, science had been used as a tool to discover how God had done things. So even Galileo, Copernicus, some of those individuals that developed ideas that challenged traditional Christian teaching of the time still understood the world, understood science as being a way to understand God. But from the Enlightenment period on, science became more and more of a way to explain reality, removing God completely out of the equation. Now, it wasn't necessarily scientists actively denying God. But the change had been to move from understanding how God did things to understanding our world simply through naturalistic answers. That the way you discover how things develop was not to appeal to God's active power in the world, but to say, well, this is how these processes naturally take place. Not only that, but throughout the 19th and into the 20th century, more and more people began to believe that essentially science had a philosophical power as well. That as we developed as a society scientifically in modern life, we would find ourselves getting closer and closer to a utopia. And so science providing us the way to heal all wounds in society. The final transition that it becomes very important in all this is an approach to culture that adopted certain forms of evolution as well. So not only is evolution being used to explain life, where life comes from, it is also then turned on culture. If humans evolved, then their cultural forms evolved as well. So the assumption is earlier forms of culture would have been simpler and gradually advanced over time. And not only are we talking about things like the usage of tools and thinking capability and technology, religion would have been included in that as well. We talked a little bit about that at the beginning of the semester. So this idea of the simplest form of religion, the original form of religion being this spiritual power, mana, found in the world, but eventually moving into animism, polytheism, henotheism, and then monotheism. Even though many of the people, anthropologists for example, who were pushing these theories, developing these theories, many claimed that they weren't denying God. Turns out they were denying God. Right? At very least, it was a functional or methodological atheism, even if it wasn't a spiritual one. And so all of these things developed as a way, especially in the Western world, to provide the opportunity, provide a atmosphere for atheism to develop as a legitimate approach to reality. Prior to this point, atheism would not have gained any sort of traction. There might have been atheists in the Middle Ages, but if they were discovered as atheists, they would have been imprisoned, they might have been tortured, etc. And so there's not the cultural framework, there's not the toolkit in society until the Enlightenment for atheism to really take hold. But what we're seeing in more modern times right, especially within the past decade or two, is what is referred to as the new atheism. So historically, we can see why atheism has increased over Western history, right, especially modern history. Although, to be fair, it has never been that big and it's never been that public. What then has led to this sudden apparent increase? What has led to the militancy that we see, especially in very public atheistic figures? Well, there are a couple of things that are influential in that development. First is the development of politically active religions. Especially in the United States, the development of the so-called religious right. So in the 1970s, a lot of Christian or conservative Christians became much more visible and active in politics. Prior to the 1970s, most conservative Christians, evangelicals, fundamentalists, were not that active in politics. They believed that God had called them to focus on missions, right, converting people. Right? That's the important thing, and that society would transform as individuals were converted. And so there wasn't as much of a push to be politically active. However, beginning in the 1970s, there were a variety of court cases, there were a variety of changes in American society that led some of these same individuals to become concerned that if they were not politically active in shaping the destiny of the country, that they would find their way of life impinged, persecuted, acted upon. This would include cases, we've mentioned some of these cases before, prayer in public schools, Bible reading in public schools. In the early 1970s, there was a case where the IRS had revoked the tax-exempt status of Bob Jones University. Bob Jones University, a rather popular fundamentalist university in South Carolina, had even into the 70s adopted a segregationist policy. They would not allow African Americans to enroll. And as a church-related organization, they felt that they had the right to do that. Well, the IRS said, well, that might be, but without admitting African Americans, we don't consider you anymore a charitable organization, and so we're going to revoke your nonprofit status, which means you now owe taxes. And probably would have been a rather sizable amount of taxes. So the case goes the whole way to the Supreme Court. Well, this appears to be one thing that really got people involved. Right? We need to make sure that the president is a Christian, to make sure that he puts the right people in the Supreme Court. Well, then added to that, Roe v. Wade about abortion increased that political involvement as well. It didn't start it. A lot of Protestant Christians up to that time did not support abortion, but believed that abortion activism was actually a Catholic issue. Right? Catholics are the ones that are active against abortion. But it's kind of rolled into all of this as well. So there are all of these things that are developing that leads Christians, conservative Protestant Christians, to want to get involved, actively promoting their worldview to shape the United States, and to do so, be political. They won elections, they helped pass legislation, they were very vocal about their opposition. Well, from the atheist standpoint, when they see this happening, they are concerned that if the religious right is extremely successful, they will turn on atheists and persecute atheists. Because in many of these Supreme Court cases, not all of them, but many of them that were hot-button issues, it had been atheists who had brought it up. Right? Public reading of Scripture, prayer in public schools. Often it was the atheist parent that was concerned that their child was having to pray or to hear the Bible. And so the fact that there were politically active religions led some atheists to say, well, we need to be politically active as well. Another development that led to the rise of the new atheism is the increase in religious violence. I say increase. Religious violence has always been around. There have always been wars that have had some sort of religious connotation to them. But if we think about really the beginning of the 21st century, it becomes a much more prominent aspect in society. And so things like 9/11, the sectarian fighting among Muslims in Iraq, instances of hatred between religions, theocratic governments, often known as Muslim, who would imprison or exterminate dissidents. Many atheists began to feel that these types of religions were going to overrun the world. They seemed so prominent. They seemed so out there. Another change in culture that led to the new atheism was probably the acceptability of challenging religion, and the acceptability of critiquing religion. While there was some criticism of religion prior to the 20th century, the second half of the 20th century, it becomes much more acceptable to critique religion. Rise of comedians making fun of religion. Movies and TV shows presenting religious people in a negative light. Now certainly, yes, there's positive examples of all that. That's not the point. The point is you have more and more people who feel that it's acceptable to challenge religion. And of course, the latter part of the 20th century, sometimes it was the religious people themselves that made religions easy targets. Televangelists and their over-the-top personas. If you don't send me $8 million, God's going to call me home. Reach your hand out to the television and touch my hand and I will heal you. These over-the-top personas made religious people easy targets. Did not help their situation. And then, of course, after the over-top personas came the scandals. Televangelists involved with prostitutes, affairs, financial misdealing, tax evasion, the hypocrisy, the foolishness. All of this made religion an easier target, which allowed people to think of religion, especially Christianity, as being a religion of the misinformed, the unaware, the ignorant, and the hateful. Right? So people like the Westboro Baptist Church. Finally, the fact that more and more media outlets would allow atheists the opportunity to come on, talk about their ideas, talk about their latest book. But in addition to that, of course, is the proliferation of media. Right? That you can go, you don't have to wait for a journalist to come interview you to get your ideas out there. You can put it on the web, you can publish books yourself. There's all sorts of ways that the later 20th century into the 21st century provided new atheists media opportunities to express this.